Well, welcome back again. In this episode, Putting Down Roots, we'll be taking a look at life in colonial America. First off, starting in New England, you'll remember that they came over as nuclear families where the husband and wife and children all came together, a lot of times with other people from the same village. And this brought a good deal of stability as family was essential to the social order of the New Englanders. Another characteristic of these families is that they were patriarchal in nature. And what this means is that the father was the head of the family and was the source of authority, and others were kind of obedient to his will. And with that, with the family being essential, as well as the village for the success of these communities, the New Englanders, the Puritans, had successfully replicated their traditional social order. And whereas single life was seen as kind of being morally suspect, and also being the fact that it was physically difficult to survive in the New World, you can see why family life was the center of society. And as these communities continued to grow throughout the 1600s, in fact, by 1700, there was roughly 120,000 people living in New England. And the fact is that as the communities grew, as children kind of started looking out to go on their own, a lot of times they would live in the same community as their parents to continue that stability. And education kind of was a family responsibility. However, as they started passing rules and regulations that if a village had at least 15 families, they needed to supply an elementary school, therefore teaching the boys and girls of the village how to read the Bible. This would also strengthen the community ties as they weren't focused on wealth, but the success of the village. And their educational system will be, roughly 100 years ahead of that of the Chesapeake region. And as you can see, by 1638, Harvard was created as to train ministers to enter the clergy. And this will be the first higher institution created in the colonies. However, as the population continued to grow in these villages, not only did the single life continue to be a source of moral questionability, but also the growing population made it tough for the children to be able to find farmland and to tend to the field of their own. And so sometimes they would leave the village and search for a new one, which would kind of weaken those family ties a little bit. But at the same time, as religion was supposedly kind of a basis for their foundation, and they were supposed to have been that beacon of righteousness, more and more people started to focus inward and not reach out as much. And as the family ties had weakened somewhat, what was eventually created was what's something called the halfway covenant, which allowed children to be baptized as long as the grandparents had been baptized, even if the parents hadn't been, as a way to try to once again strengthen the church. And even though we've already seen how these families were patriarchal in nature, women also took on a key role in the success of the family and the village. When it came to work, many times women worked alongside the men because they were needed to help with the labor on the farm in tending to the crops, as well as doing the cooking, washing, gardening, and child rearing. Now, when it comes to the church, women joined at a greater rate than that of their male counterparts, oftentimes at about a 2-to-1 ratio. And sometimes we speculate that the difficulty of pregnancy and the tough life in general caused them to join the church at that higher rate. However, they did lack some of the kind of rights that we take for granted today. When it comes to property, they weren't allowed to sell it. They couldn't petition for divorce, and so you can see they did lack some of the social and political, equality to that of the male counterparts. Now, as the New Englanders replicated their traditional social order, you got to remember that people that made the trip over a lot of times weren't the wealthy because they were already living pretty well back in England. And so, all of the people that came, a new order or a new leader had to develop. And as people accumulated more wealth, they became the natural leaders of the society. However, the vast majority of people were simply yeoman farmers or independent farmers. They tended to their own fields and lands and kind of were subsistence in their farming, and they could maybe barter or trade off any of their surplus. At the bottom of the social hierarchy would be the servants. Um, and this, whether you're wealthy or poor, many people served as a servant for some time of their life. Maybe it was to learn a trade or a skill. Um, but many times, once you served your time, you learned your skill, you were able to kind of move on with your life. But it wasn't uncommon to serve some time as an apprentice, learning something. Now, to be able to further contrast New England with the Chesapeake region, here's some of the developments going on in this region. And as we saw back in Chapter 2, the Chesapeake region had some unique characteristics to themselves, as people who came were usually indentured servants, perhaps as many as 80% who came were indentured servants. Men came at a 6-to-1 ratio over women, and most of them were young, single servants, usually poor to middling class. But they didn't come over as family units. They weren't wealthy, and many died before their terms of service was up. Many of them dying from things such as malaria, disease, or the poor drinking water. And as you might expect, the results of so many people dying after arriving, that the life expectancy was an appalling 43 years, much lower than that in the New England area or even back in England itself. And with the death rate so high, only 1 in 3 marriages actually survived a decade. So many times you would see people remarry. Obviously, we talked about not getting to know their grandparents like you would up in New England. You also see another characteristic is that the education did lag behind that of New England because the belief was kind of if half the kids are going to die before adulthood, really, why go through the troubles of educating them? In fact, those that could afford it, the rich would send theirs back to England to receive their education because there was no really good formal schooling in the Chesapeake region. And what we see develop in the Chesapeake region is that tobacco will become the staple crop of the Chesapeake, and this crop will create a disparity in wealth and status. And those that are able to harvest more and create more wealth are there then able to buy more slaves. And what you see is that the rich become the ruling elite, and the idea of what's kind of called slavocracy. The wealthy white landowners that owned more slaves kind of became the natural leaders of society. And we'll see kind of the growth of slavery spread then throughout this region. However, prior to turning to Africa for slaves, these new settlers did attempt to enslave Native Americans, but you can see some of the pros and cons when it came to using these Native Americans as their source of labor, even though they were readily available and cheap because they were in the region. They also knew the land and could escape more easily. Also, they died at a great rate of disease. And then you risk the idea of the rest of the natives in the area attacking to try to free them. So eventually, Africans are used as slave labor. Obviously, they wouldn't know the land as well. They didn't know where to run to. They didn't usually die of the disease. And if they did run away, it's tough for them to blend in a city or escape to some Native American tribe. However, obviously it was very expensive, and therefore only the very wealthy could afford African slaves. Now, the first African slaves were probably obtained by stealing them from the Dutch and landed in Virginia in 1619. And even though some may actually have come over as indentured servants, others, though small in number, may actually have purchased their own freedoms and even become wealthy planters. However, as more were brought over, eventually we see the development of more stricter laws regulating slavery to try to keep them from rebelling, and you also see justifications for the use of slaves, whether it be trying to give them a better life, considering them as heathens, and trying to Christianize them, and try to provide for them and give them a better life than what they had in Africa. And kind of taking that paternalistic approach where the father figure is providing for a better life than what they would have experienced otherwise. And as we all know of the triangle trade that existed between Africa, Europe, and the Americas, it was probably due to the high cost of transportation during what's known as the Middle Passage, when the African slaves were brought over to the New World. And because that cost was so high, it probably kept more slaves from coming over than you might expect. However, what changes that eventually is when the monopoly on the slave trade is eventually broken, and which allows other companies to partake in the slave trade, which thusly increases the supply of slaves and then drives down the prices. And then that will eventually lead to an increase in sales. And finally, a couple of concluding characteristics about colonial slavery. First of all, is the fact that by the early 1700s, due to the increase in birth rates, we do see an increase in the population of slaves. Secondly, we also see a continuation of slaves coming into the colonies, and as more slaves are brought in, they're eventually looked down upon by those who were born here because the newcomers were more likely to revolt, run away, or strike out against the institution of slavery in some fashion. One of the most famous early rebellions that took place in the British colonies prior to the Revolutionary War took place in 1739 and was known as the Stono Rebellion. In this rebellion, roughly 150 slaves in the colony of South Carolina attempted to flee towards Florida, which was still held by the Spanish, before the revolt was eventually put down. However, until it was put down, it took the lives of roughly 20 whites and maybe another 40 slaves, and then some that were kind of on the loose as fugitives, for maybe 3 months or more even. But most of them were eventually caught, and then either executed or sold off into slavery in the West Indies. But regardless of when slaves were brought into the colonies, they did attempt to preserve elements of their African culture. And many times there was a blending of their culture with Christianity, which kind of created an African heritage that was intermixed with kind of aspects of both cultures. And so you kind of see the try to preserve their heritage as kind of a new one is being developed here in the colonies. But we'll take a closer look at further developments in colonial America in future presentations.